Morning. Happy New Year, Happy New Decade, everyone. Glad that you made it here this morning. I want to call the Hillsborough County MPO to order. Would everyone please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance and invocation? Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our gracious and heavenly Father, we're so thankful that you touch us with your loving hands to awaken us to see another one of your beautiful days. We ask that you be with us today as we make decisions to make this county a better place for all of us to live, work, and play. We ask that you guide us in this new year, that we can be all on one accord, even if we have to disagree sometimes, that we all work for the betterment of the people of this county. We ask you to be with our first responders, ask you to be with those soldiers that are putting their lives on the line for us every day, and those that are MTS or fire or police that are working on behalf of us and putting their lives on the line for us every day, that when their work is done, they go back to their homes and find everything safe and sound. These are all blessings we ask in your righteous and holy name. Amen. Amen. You have the minutes from the December 3rd, 2019 MPO meeting. Hope you had an opportunity to review those. There are motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Kemp, second by Commissioner Overman to approve those December 3rd, 2019 minutes. Sorry about that. Any discussion? See no discussion. All those in favor, let me know by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, likewise. Motion is adopted. Now moving to public comment. Do we have anyone wanting to address the board this morning? Anyone from the public wishing to address the board this morning? Seeing none? Okay. Committee report and online comments. Mr. Roberts, good morning.
Good morning, members of the MPO Board, and Happy New Year to you all. I'm Bill Roberts. I chair your Citizens Advisory Committee, and I'd like to give you a brief report on our joint meeting on December 16th, where the CAC met with the Technical Advisory Committee as well. Under action items, both committees reviewed and forwarded to this board recommendation on the Hillsborough Greenway and Trails plan update, which I think is on your agenda for today. In other action, both committees heard reports from a couple of different opportunities. We heard a status report on the agency plans for the 2020 transportation surtax. There were understandably a lot of questions about both the status of the IOC as well as a number of the proposals that were submitted. Concern was also expressed about the safety and lighting at transit stops as these plans move forward. Members were interested in the next steps for the IOC and the project plans submitted by the various governments. And we had a good discussion about the close coordination on projects of mutual interest between the city and the county. I think your CAC is feeling strongly that this is an opportunity for the city and the county to work even more closely together, and that discussion was very healthy. We heard a report on the Fletcher Avenue Complete Street Program. Members complimented the county for a successful project with a high return on investment. This project seems to have gone extremely well. It's received high praise from our committee. I drive that Fletcher area frequently, and I think it's gone very well. There were a couple of questions that our committee members raised about the Fletcher Avenue project, such as would more before and after studies be conducted in order to assess the effectiveness of that project? Were drivers getting accustomed to the flashing beacons and yielding for pedestrians at mid-block? The response to that question seemed to be that it's an educational process and it seems to be getting better. And finally, would protected bike lanes be better and perhaps encourage cyclists to use those instead of riding on the sidewalk? Fletcher Avenue, as you know, is a congested avenue, and a lot of bike riders are using the sidewalk instead of the relatively narrow bicycle lanes. Our committee, the CAC, heard a refresher on government in the sunshine and the public records refresher. which generated a lot of discussion amongst our members as to what constitutes topics that may be actionable. The board, our committee, would like to have further guidance on what conversations could be held in less public meetings regarding things that are not action items coming before our committee. And finally, we had a refresher on meeting procedures and Robert's Rules of Order. So I thank you for your attention. Be happy to take any questions you might have.
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Roberts.
Thank you again. Happy New Year.
Ms. Torres, good morning.
Morning. Happy New Year. Gina Torres, the MPO staff. Just to follow up on the other committees that met, the Bicycle, Pedestrian, and Livable Roadways committees both also approved the changes to the Greenways and Trails Master Plan maps, and that's on your agenda for action. The Transportation Disadvantage Coordinating Board elected its officers for 2020, and it re-elected Gloria Mills as vice chair and Craig Forsell as member at large. Other presentations to the committees included agency project plans for the 2020 use of the surtax, Fletcher Avenue Complete Streets before and after. That is coming to your committee or the board in March, and I think you'll be impressed. If you weren't supportive of complete street transformations, even the travel time wasn't affected very much. So it's stealing their thunder, but you're going to enjoy that presentation, I think. Government in the Sunshine State and Public Records refresher, as well as Robert's Rules of Order, were all discussed at the committees. The Transportation Disadvantaged Legislative Awareness Day will be held on February 11th in Tallahassee. The annual legislative message is included in your addendum in your packet. The MPO Chair's Coordinating Committee approved and forwarded to you the 2020 CCC Interlocal Agreement and Operating Procedures. That's also for action today on your agenda. And they also approved the Regional Transportation Priorities Update that supports HART to negotiate with CSX. The CCC heard status reports on the Florida Transportation Plan, Regional Transit Development Plan, and the Tampa Bay TMA Leadership Group Update. For your online comments, there were no Facebook posts posted for this meeting, but there were 4 emails Mike Lamarca wrote concerned with the lack of maintenance of the bicycle lanes, citing Bayshore Boulevard and US 41 had debris. He sent some pictures. Lena Young-Green encourages our continued effort in safe route connections between schools, after-school activities, and community gardens. She also requested regular presentations on Vision Zero to the Dowdell Middle School in Palm River. Emails were exchanged with Patricia Getz, a teacher at Wharton High School, and between her and the County Public Works Department. There was a sidewalk in front of the school that the contractors were blocking, and there was a lot of kids that walk to and from school, so the Public Works Department went right out there. Actually, I think they went out there twice to make sure that they leave that sidewalk open and available for after-school hours. And lastly, Peter Hsu from District 7 shared his appreciation in an email that the Clear Guide data portal will include crash prediction model. So those were your online comments and the rest of your committee reports. I'm actually your next item, so I'm going to stand here unless there's something else.
Any questions? Any questions? Moving to action items. Tampa-Hillsborough Greenways and Trails Plan Update.
Morning again. I'm going to provide this update to you. This is for consideration. This is for action today. I'll just go through just a handful of maps that have some minor alignment changes. It requires actions for the approved Greenways and Trails Master Plan. Just take a couple minutes to go through these. The Harney US 301, there was a change here. You can see that the proposed Old Fort King Trail was proposed along Harney. I wonder if you can see my pointer. Here's where it was proposed, and it's been shifted to align with Fowler and US 301. It just made for a more practical connection, and that's envisioned to be a 12-foot multi-use trail. And it will connect then the Tampa Bypass Canal, which is right, I'm going to try to do this because it's hard to see, but over here, over to this existing trail on Fort King. The Flatwoods Park, the existing map didn't show a connection from the Tampa Bypass Canal here, so it just makes sense to add that connection here from the Bypass Canal up to Flatwoods. This is preliminary design, but it is undergoing a current route study. So this alignment that you see, which makes sense, there is now showing a connection. May shift a little bit, but that will, is being looked at right now. The US 41 Alafia River change, it's kind of almost pretty hard to see. Initially, the South Coast Greenway, the idea was to kind of align the trail a little closer to the water, and it was actually in a coastal wetlands area along a road that would have required mangroves to be destroyed and some other things. It just made sense to realign this now instead along 41, instead of over here to the west. And that is a proposed route that I think it might be partially funded. I'm sorry, I don't have that information, but it might be partially funded. In Manatee, the section of the Greenways and Trails master plan that showed with the Manatee connection, Manatee had, we've added this connection that they had preferred on their side of the county line, and it really makes sense to have that there because it was also in the adopted Florida Sun Trail. So we're just being consistent with those two plans. Oh, look, it went before me. The 674, this was a connection that was requested by Waimama Now Community Group. This is not what I wanted to do there. It's really hard. Well, you can see where the line is here, and it is not over here. That makes a lot of sense because it connects to the soon-to-be-completed 301 side path. And there's a lot of stores and destination points along that areas like a Walmart right there. So it made sense to have that as a proposed trail on the master plan. Van Dyke, this is exciting news. There was not a connection, and there was always interest in connecting to Lake Park to the existing Upper Tampa Bay Trail right here. So Van Dyke is currently undergoing a PD&E, and the county is including that kind of connection there to Lake Park. So that's really exciting because it's funded. Only two more, by the way. Memorial, this is in the town and country area. They're adding a proposed alignment along Memorial, this is where the existing map looks. And although it needs to be studied, it just made sense to try to have that connection showing so that in the future that could be considered. The county is also using surtax dollars to study the complete street here. That's what's pink is the George Road, and looking at a complete street. Lastly, this is other great news, the changes to the bridges map was to show that the Howard Franklin is now a funded bike facility, a bike ped multi-use trail facility, and also that proposing that Gandy also include a trail for multi-use purposes. And the BPAC, on both sides of the water, St. Pete and Hillsborough, had sent letters to the DOT, and we're very happy to see that they're considering making that connection. There was just a couple other things you don't see on the maps, but this just kind of summarizes the changes that are being, like there's an Apollo Beach, there's a change to the existing trail, just it wasn't showing correctly on the map. And that is just to reiterate, all of the committees that had this presentation, CAC, TAC, BPAC, and Liberal Roads all suggested approval of the changes to the map. So if you would like, I would answer questions if I can, and ask for approval of the changes.
Okay. Commissioner Oman, you have a question or you want to make?
Just a question, and then I'll make a motion. On the Memorial project side, it looks like you're creating some nice connections there. There's a break between Eisenhower Memorial and George Road.
Oh,
Is
you're
that
talking about right here.
On purpose?
Now, it's anybody from the county staff here, because I wanted to make sure that I do say things properly here, but that is not good. I think that's incorrect. I think the proposed
Does
trail
go through.
connects.
Okay. It just seems that we're making all this effort to make the connection, and yet there's not a connection
Yeah,
there. So-
there's going to be a connection, right? You're talking about this part right here where I'm moving the,
Yeah.
yeah.
So there
actually-
is some continuity there, or
That actually
it's
connects
still in the
already.
works?
Yes, there will be continuity there. I will make sure that the final map shows that connection.
Thank you.
You might know this.
I think that's Skyway Park. So it goes into the back of Skyway Park, and where the pink and light green lines intersect is the entrance to Skyway Park.
Okay. So you go through the
There's some
park?
on-road- yeah.
Okay, great. So with that, I move approval.
Motion by Commissioner
Second.
Oman, second by Commissioner Smith. Is there further discussion? Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, let it be known by saying aye.
Aye.
Likewise, motion adopted. Thank you. Updates to the interlocal agreement for the MPO Chairs Coordinating Committee. Ms. Alden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We talked about these updates at our meeting last month. There are no significant changes since we talked about it last month. We did bring the proposed changes to the regional meeting of the MPO chairs that was a little bit later in December. They asked us to make one minor correction, which was to delete the reference to the Withlacoochee Regional Planning Council, which no longer exists. So having made that correction, we are now bringing it to you for approval. As a quick refresher, the scope of the changes are reflecting that TBARTA now serves a smaller geographic area and focuses specifically on transit. So this reestablishes the role of the MPOs to take the lead in coordinating regional multimodal transportation planning and priorities. It also establishes the TMA Leadership Group as a subcommittee of the overall MPO Chairs Coordinating Committee and documents some of the operating procedures for the TMA Leadership Group, such as electing an annual chair. Are there any questions about the changes to the agreement?
Any questions? What's your pleasure?
Move to approve.
Motion by
Second.
Commissioner Overman, second by Commissioner Kemp, to approve the updates to the interlocal agreement for the MPO's Chairs Coordinating Committee. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, let it be known by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, likewise, motion's adopted. Status reports, healthy multimodal, you know what I mean.
Good morning, Board, and Michelle Ogilvie, MPO staff. Just to give you some context on the next presentation, 1 year ago, on January 8th of 2019, the MPO Board adopted a Health in All Policies resolution supporting and acknowledging the power of complete streets, such as sidewalks, bike lanes, street trees, and plantings. Also, access to transit, active recreation, and healthy food choices have on encouraging and supporting people to have healthier lives and choices. Also in 2019, the MPO Board was acknowledged and recognized by the Healthiest Cities and Counties Challenge for the work you have done in advancing healthy, human health, creating a health atlas, which is a data-driven process, and supporting active transportation and healthy food connections in the Garden Steps project. Today, you have Mr. I should have asked you how to pronounce your name, so may I call him Curtis, is here today to expand the possibilities and utility of data and health in all of our policy and planning processes in transportation.
Morning.
Morning, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Thank you for having us here. I also have my colleague, Mr. Keith Smith. We're both with VHB, 225 East Robinson in Orlando. And for the record, it's Kurt Ostratka. Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction. So I believe is our presentation being brought up? Oh, do I? Okay, thank you very much. So we'd like to share with you research that we've been conducting for about the last 2 years that we think would be supportive of your Health in All Policies resolution. We want to start with is every good transportation project starts with a purpose and need. And of course, we've all been, seeing graphics like these, trends about health for the last, several decades, about how our waistlines are really not getting any healthier. I'm feeling that myself after the holiday break. And we've seen plenty of federal guidance that we need to understand and have a better impact on how transportation and the built environment and health are linked. So there's plenty of federal guidance, but not as many step-by-step guides for how to actually take that guidance and use it in a practical manner. So what we have done is we've been developing a model in which we hope to be able to analyze land use, urban design, and mobility factors all together in order to better understand the effects on community health. And what we can use that for is to establish a baseline for measurement over time. So it could be very useful for long-range planning. And then also where health data is not available, we believe our model is useful for forecasting likely health outcomes and conditions today. And of course, be able to use all the big data that's being collected by transportation organizations, the U.S. Census, and be able to pull that together into a scalable model that can be used anywhere. So the question always comes up, how do you find health data? And it's relatively easy to find at a county-wide level, but that doesn't help you when you're doing neighborhood planning or corridor planning because, again, you're measuring against the entire county. So you can ask people to self-assess their health, but that isn't a statistical representation of a community or a neighborhood. You can do a health impact assessment, which is really a door-to-door survey, very labor-intensive and costly. Or you can, if you're lucky enough, you can sometimes find that data from a hospital or a Department of Health. But usually we found in practice that doesn't match up with the neighborhood you're trying to study or a quarter you're trying to study. So we conducted several different healthy community design symposiums to try to get the answer to that question. And we found that while there's a lot of individual success stories and varied methodologies, there's really no silver bullet or model to study health at a discrete enough level, such as a neighborhood or a corridor, that would allow you to make meaningful decisions from that information. So we started developing what we call our healthy mobility model, and we use the 500 cities database as a starting point. So this is, I believe, some of the data that underpins the county's, the MPO's Health Atlas tool that's been being developed. And what this is it looks at health risk assessments at the census tract level, which is a much more discrete and useful kind of data point for the 500 largest cities in the country. And that's great if you're in, say, the city of Tampa, because then you can get the census tract data at that level. But if you're in Plant City or the unincorporated county, you're not represented in this data set. So we wanted to see if there was a way to help fill in the gaps, and Keith will show you how we've been able to accomplish that. So what we've put in our model is not only the demographic and 500 cities data, but we've also included planning level data. So the location of grocery stores, location of or presence or absence of sidewalks, transit stops, density, intensity, and all this runs through the model to, again, provide some information about that could be useful for public health and transportation decisions. We did our homework, we did our research, looking at how others have studied this in the past. I think Ewing and Severo have written some papers that really establish the connectivity between the built form, transportation, and public health. We also looked at different industry standards. APA, ULI put out a number of different national standards, so we wanted to make sure we could, calibrate that for each community that would potentially use this. We also talked to our peer groups. So Dr. Richard Jackson literally wrote the book Building Healthy Communities, was a former CDC head. Leslie Meehan is now with the Tennessee Department of Health, but she was formerly with the Nashville MPO and did some of the pilot research on how you can use health to better guide your long-range planning decisions. Dr. Chris Jones is here in town. He's an economist and adjunct professor for USF. He helped us with some of the statistical modeling that Keith will talk about. And we've also been working with a Central Florida working group. So I will let Keith go through some of the nuts and bolts, and we'd be happy to answer your questions afterwards.
Sure, thank you, Kurt. So one of the biggest things we realized looking at this, there's really kind of two tiers of this approach. The first one was really a risk assessment, identifying from the CDC data as well as the census tract data that was available, could we help identify where the areas are currently at risk? And then we went into a tier two that was much more on the ground. So in the tier one, we started with the 500 cities data, and this was really meant to be a starting point so that we could take and infer from that, could we cover the entire state? What we were able to do is using regression analysis, actually drill in and found out that we could find statistical representations that allowed us to do that. Now the great thing about that, it also meant that we could go into the future as the data from the Census Bureau continues to update, we can continue those projections moving forward, which means that this is not a static one-time run. As that data comes out every year, we're able to continue advancing forward with that. Here you can actually see this is the output of that is in the downtown Tampa, as well as you can see the St. Pete side of it. And what's great about this is that as we look at every one of these tracks, we're actually going in there and taking an analysis on the risk level and identifying an overall score of how at risk is that particular tract, as well as looking at the top 6 disease factors that we were wanting to compare: diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic heart disease, obesity, high cholesterol, and asthma. So we could get a really good comprehensive idea of exactly what was going on with every one of those tracks in relation to those 6 chronic diseases. So from that, now that we've gone through and done that risk assessment, have an understanding of where the locations that we believe we have the most risk at, how do we actually take that and turn it into a real result? That's where the Tier 2 comes in, where we go into the on-the-ground side of it, doing the community health strategies. And again, we're taking a look at all those planning data sets, because this really lets us get into the groundwork of it, and we're looking at things such as block length. We're looking at the proximity to schools. We're looking at proximity to grocery stores, proximity to the parks, really bringing in that whole community aspect to really understand what's happening at the ground level. And what we did was we looked across a series of different parameters we started considering, such as on-street, off-street, access to grocery stores, and really bringing in that community aspect of it. What we were able to do from there was over in the Tropicana site around St. Pete, we actually analyzed that area looking at this type of analysis. And what we're looking at was, first of all, we saw from the risks that there were areas that were identified as being at risk for these different diseases, as well as some that were benefiting from not having that. Because of that, we ran that regression analysis again now at the community level, using all those planning factors and all that other data that is much more difficult to collect. But since we're doing this on a very detailed scale, now we could really drill in and understand what was happening there. And we started to see things about that 2 of the biggest takeaways were that off-street parking really seemed to reduce a lot of these risks, as well as being able to make sure you had access to grocery stores. Those were 2 that stood out, and they were both very strongly represented in the regression analysis that we did. And as we started to move forward with this on the applicable side of it, we looked at it from the standpoint of we can now start actually making policy recommendations about how do we actually enact change that can affect this, as far as making sure that if we're looking at what are the frontage uses, what are the parking limitations, that we're using that, as well as going into strategies to make sure that things such as grocery stores and other aspects to get healthy food are available to citizens, and how can we help enact that. So those are 2 of the kind of pieces of how do we actually take this from just a risk assessment and actually get it all the way through to policy and design. We're also taking and expanding this tool even further now. You saw the example we did with the Trop site. We're now going to use that for part of the St. Pete 2050 visioning and actually take it out across the entire city, because we have the ability to do that and really drill in and hopefully tell a very comprehensive story about health in the community and be able to enact some changes and show what are some good strategies that may help correct some of the problems that they're seeing. With that, I think we'll take questions.
Any questions? Commissioner Kemp, you recognized.
Thank you. I was very curious. I thank you for explaining the assessment, but I was seriously taken aback that it's difficult to get data, and I was wondering, because I've seen maps generated here where at 275 from downtown to north, and also 275 as it goes out, there's a big red marker wide along it with regards to poor air quality, but also, I thought, increased asthma, childhood asthma, all kinds of risk factors involved in being close and to the interstates and to the heavy traffic and the particulate. I've also seen watershed studies that have gone on across the country now about the very serious risk of cardiovascular, asthma, cancer, maybe even dementia that occurs if you live within 1 mile of a major interstate, and the fallout that comes from particulate and air pollution. So I'm just wondering how they do those studies and if you know from Tampa, because am I imagining that I've seen this?
No, you're not imagining it. Tampa is one of 500 cities in the country where there is more detailed health data available, but unfortunately, it's just within Tampa city limits.
Right. But couldn't you at least have access to that? Because that would seem like a huge part of what the problem is here, or something we have to know about.
So yes, we could, if there is additional supplemental data available, we could certainly incorporate it into what we're looking at. I can't comment on some of the specific cases that you discussed, but they may have had air quality sensors established in the area, or they may have actually done the door-to-door health impact assessment study. So our process is an alternative to that in the absence of being able to actually go door-to-door with folks.
And one other thing, I've also seen, and I'm trying to learn more about it, but that there are developed low-cost, high air quality sensors that they're starting to use this kind of group, community, neighborhood tagging of air quality. I guess there's huge, and they have sites online where they're registering their sensors. I think it's like really big in Europe and starting to be big in Canada. So do you have knowledge of that? And is that something that we can get some more information on?
So we do have knowledge of that, as many cities and communities are looking at what are called smart city solutions or future-ready solutions. Environmental sensors is a big component of that because it allows you to measure information over time that allows you to identify any vulnerable populations and then come up with specific mitigation strategies to help solve those issues.
There were two things around on the data side of it that really factor into part of this. One of them was we had to make sure we collect enough data for the regression analysis to work properly. So one of the biggest problems that we run into, and that's why we relied on the 500 cities, is you're correct on the air sensors, but it's making sure we have enough coverage that we can use it as something that will be reliable across enough census tracts to give us an output. The other side of that is you're correct. There's a lot of other data that we're looking at to include into this. And as those data sets continue to be developed and added on and are available, there'll be things that can be rolled into this and we'll be looking at.
Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Thank you for your report. I'm looking forward to actually reading it. So, and because the county itself is looking at adopting health and all policies at a county level in concert with what we've adopted at the MPO level. So having guidelines on how that manifests in other areas of our county work is, I think, a value. But to Commissioner Kemp's point, we do have a lot of data with the EPC actually monitors not only water quality but air quality. I know that FDOT has a variety of sensors out in line with their SEIS. So when you're pulling data, do you have access, or are you able to gain access to that kind of data and incorporate that available?
Yes. So the answer to that was, if you remember the two tiers we talked about, the tier one is very much risk assessment. That one is using the census data. We wanted something we could use across geographies anywhere in the country. The tier two is where we really get in on the ground in the community level. And that's where, yes, if there's data available that's provided across the county that from FDOT, from any of the other resources that can be used, we can certainly leverage that into all that analysis and make sure that that's part of the analysis that we're looking at and making sure we get the best data available. That's one of the pieces of that, why you saw we kind of listed out here the things that we were looking at in the case of the trop site. That is certainly not the end of that list by any means. We include as much data as we can get our hands on. So when we go in and we do something more detailed, and we're looking at, okay, how do we affect this at the county level? We'll include as much data from all the sources that are available as long as it's at the level we can use it. In this case, we're looking at census tracts, so we want to make sure that data can transfer over to a census tract level relatively easily. That way we can use it in the statistical regression analysis.
And given that we have, as you mentioned, areas of the county that are maybe less populated and maybe less of those resources available, you're working with our local county health department to gather information from them, given we have health centers all over the county?
Yeah, we'll take as much information as we can, and we have ways the same way we use the 500 cities data to extrapolate out those areas that we didn't have values. We do the same type of analysis, again, looking at that for those areas where we maybe don't have as strong data and making sure that we can correlate across to try to fill in those gaps as best we can. Some of the more rural areas, there may be cases where we just simply don't have data to represent those locations, but we feel like we can get a pretty accurate view of most of it.
Okay, great. And do you incorporate social services demands within the county? For example, children's services, eviction notices, those kinds of things that impact family stability?
We have not at this time, but it's certainly something, if we had the data, we could. One of the great things about the approach we took on this was it was very data-driven, and that's where the regression analysis came in. We ultimately looked at close to 150 factors originally. So, and what was good about that is we didn't limit anything we were looking at. We let the data itself tell us what was important. So if we're able to incorporate as much information as we possibly can into that, and we let those regressions, those correlations themselves show up, things like that where it says this is something that is very important will come to the top on its own. A good example of that was the proximity to grocery stores. We knew there was a relationship there, but we didn't realize just how strong it was until we did this analysis. And we realized that that was one of the sort of the highest indicators directly tied to health. So we'll be able to do that same type of thing.
The only limitation is we have to analyze at least one additional census tract for each variable. So if we analyze 100 variables, at the same time, we need to look at 101 census tracts.
Okay, thank you.
And that's how the regression works.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.
Ms. McKinley. Transit major projects, next steps.
All right. Good morning, Sarah McKinley, MPO staff. This morning, I'm going to sort of start off a discussion, and then we're going to go into 3 presentations looking at our next steps for transit within Hillsborough County and the Tampa Bay region. We have 3 projects that are independently developed that are being coordinated. And each of these projects have the potential to seek federal grants. So the purpose of this presentation and discussion today is sort of to start building that consensus as a board of what we would like to bring to the region for support. Like I mentioned, each of these have the potential to seek federal grants. The streetcar extension could seek those grants as early as this year, with both the regional rapid transit and the BRT arterial study seeking federal grants as soon as 2021. There's also other factors such as the Road 60 West Shore interchange that has been funded, so making sure that we can leverage that and the other interstate redevelopment projects to sort of leverage that regional rapid transit project as well. So we're going to go through each of these 3 presentations and then have a discussion sort of where we want to move forward with these projects in preparation for the March TMA meeting, as well as what requests we would like as support as a region. We have, as a board, we supported Pinellas with the Central Avenue BRT, so sort of in that sort of sense, moving these for our projects forward as well. So we have Milton Martinez with the City of Tampa to present the Tampa Streetcar Extension. We have Justin Willits with HART to present the BRT Arterial Study, and then Brian Pissarro with TBARTA to present the Regional Rapid Transit Study. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Milton.
Good morning, Chairman and members of the board. My name is Milton Martinez. I'm the Chief Transportation Engineer for the City of Tampa, and I'm also serving as the project manager for the Envision Tampa Streetcar Extension and Modernization Study. This project was made available or made possible through a FDOT grant, an Intermodal Development Program grant, which was DOT co-funded the project. And this project builds on several previous studies that have been done, including the Envision Center City Plan that the city completed in 2012, the HART extension study that HART completed looking at extending the streetcar system in 2014, as well as the MPO's Transit Assets and Opportunities Study that was completed in 2014. So the project, we're currently in the feasibility and project development phase. We completed the feasibility phase, which came up with a recommended alignment using Tampa, Florida, to extend all the way to Tampa Heights. And we received approval from the Federal Transit Administration to enter into project development, which we're in the process of completing now. So the intent of the project is to make the streetcar system a more of a viable transportation option for not only visitors to the city, but also residents and employees that work in the downtown area as well. So we have a presentation, and with me is Steve Shoecraft, who is the project manager for HDR, who is the lead consultant on the project. And he's going to step through more of the detail on where we are with the project and the next steps and the status of as we complete the feasibility phase of the project in 2020, with plans to, we're going to progress into quickly progress into 30% design plans as we line up the project for submittal to the FTA for getting into the grant cycle. We're anticipating submitting in August of 2020, later this year. With that, I'll turn it over. And we also provided a handout of the slide presentation to all the members. And with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Shoecraft.
Thanks, Bill. Steve Shoecraft with HDR, the project manager for this phase of the study, which is feasibility and project development. I think we covered a couple of these slides through Milton's presentation, so I'll go quickly through the front end, and then we'll get into a description of where we are with the project now and what the next steps are, immediate next steps on the project are. So as Milton said, this grew out partly from the Envision plan, which included a series of broad strategies to improve livability, competitiveness, and sustainability for downtown Tampa. This project was defined to look at modernization and extension of the existing system, improve access, substantially improve access across the full core of the city with a one-seat trip from end to end, to connect the premier cultural entertainment destinations, educational institutions, and revitalizing urban neighborhoods in and around downtown, to deliver first and last mile connectivity with regional services that access the edge of downtown but don't always penetrate close enough to destinations to make it an easy walk, and to set the stage for future extensions. So as Milton said, the city of Tampa has been leading this project as the owner of the assets for the streetcar. That's a logical stage in the process right now. FDOT has been a partner and a sponsor for the project, and we've been working closely with HART as the operator of the existing system and the potential grant recipient from FTA. I won't belabor this one. You understand the context of downtown Tampa. Things are changing dramatically. They've changed dramatically since we started the project just 2 years ago, and that what's in the pipeline is real work and real construction, and we're going to see a significant change in the way people live and work and move around downtown. We like to show this slide as a context slide. So that grant from DOT resulted in a significant increase in ridership of the system. So that grant supported removal of fares, extended hours of service, and improved frequency of service. So a lot of people associate the improvement of the ridership increase just to the free fares, but there's other things that are happening both to the system in terms of delivering better service, and changes downtown. So we've seen a lot of removal of a lot of inexpensive surface parking. We've seen a lot of new development. We've seen new activity downtown, and that's all resulting in this significant uptick. The other thing we notice when we look at the numbers, if you compare the blue to the green on this chart, we're not seeing a decline. So that novelty, what we thought could have been a novelty first few months of service improvement, has actually continued. So the ridership is staying a significant increase, approaching 300%. Currently, as Milton mentioned, we're wrapping up the project development phase of the work, and that involves our coordination with FTA and our evaluation of the project for impacts through NEPA and Section 106. We were accepted into Small Starts project development. We have ongoing coordination meetings with FTA as we work through the process. The preferred extension alternative has been selected, as well as the modernization improvements. Environmental, cultural, traffic assessments through the NEPA process have been submitted to FTA and are under review. We are working with the city and HART on revising the governance agreements to clarify roles as the project advances into design and construction. And we're developing the funding and implementation plan to identify the detailed share of support for both capital and operating costs in the project. The city is going to move forward with 30% design, so where we move into more detailed evaluation of the extension and the modernization improvements. And The ratings research is underway now, and that will be submitted to FTA next cycle. So the cycle is typically August, September timeframe, where the city would submit all their rating documentation and request a rating from FTA, and then that puts them in the queue for funding. So we've had a significant cycle of public engagement through the process. We've had 5 large-scale public workshops, and we've had, I don't know the number, Milton, dozens and dozens of smaller-scale workshops, briefings, meetings with community groups and organizations to update folks as we work through the process. As part of that coordination effort, we've worked closely with the existing projects that this ties to in some way. So the key projects that we've been focused on are the Heights Mobility Study, which is looking at changes to the Tampa-Florida pair to the north end of downtown, extending further north, which overlaps the project. The Arterial, North-South BRT or Arterial BRT study by Hart, which you'll hear about in a minute. The Regional Rapid Transit Study that we can connect to and have Streetcar provide significant first mile, last mile connections to that service to make that key down, from door to door connection. The Intermodal Center Study, which is looking at potential sites for a new intermodal central point of connection across different modes of transit. And then Virgin Brightline, we've had a series of meetings as they're looking at thinking about their terminal location. We're wanting to make sure Streetcar is a big part of their thought process as they go through that. So the project itself, as we work through the initial phases, the purpose and need and our initial context analysis, we focused on the best way to deliver high-quality, accessible service across the broadest footprint of downtown and greater downtown. We looked at a one-seat trip from end to end, not changing technologies or not causing a switch in modes. Full-day frequent service, high-capacity vehicles, stops with level boarding to improve accessibility, and designed for use by other transit vehicles. So these stops and the guideways are designed to be used by existing buses, BRT vehicles, or possibly future autonomous vehicles. In looking at the corridors and thinking about how best to integrate this new service through the core of downtown, we looked at ways to avoid congestion impacts, minimize impact on the transit service, but also minimize impact on traffic capacity, avoid parking and turning queue conflicts, and then minimize impacts on parking, sidewalks, minimize the need for right-of-way, and minimize impact on cultural and archaeological resources. So that was kind of stacked up and guided our analysis of different corridor alternatives and specific guideway alternatives. So the project is really, we talk about the project in 2 parts. Part of that is associated with funding. FTA small starts funds extensions. They don't fund significant modernization. We're working with them on exactly how to split it up for their purposes, but we carry that distinction forward. So modernization is the improvements we need to do to introduce modern vehicles on the existing line. And that involves reconstructing a few of the tight turns. So some of those turning radiuses are tight. We'd have to adjust the tracks to improve the stops for level boarding. So removing the ramp and high block and allowing for a higher platform construction within the footprint of the existing stops. Expand the streetcar barn to accommodate new vehicles and a larger fleet and the upgrade traction power. And then the extension, after evaluating a series of options, was a fairly straightforward decision to go with the Florida-Tampa pair to take advantage of the existing traffic operations and slip in a guideway on those corridors to the extent that we can. And I'll talk about that more in a second. So after comparing the performance of different broad corridors, looking at ridership and impacts and connectivity with key destinations, this corridor rose to the top of the list. It's Florida northbound to Palm, turning at Palm and going south on Tampa, and then connecting by Whiting back to the existing line. Mostly exclusive guideway service, and we're designing the project with stops on the right side of the vehicle. So buses, a conventional local bus has only doors on the right side. So a local bus could use that stop, streetcar can use the stop, and other vehicles could use that same stop. So the alignment, we went through a careful evaluation once the alignment was set about exactly where it goes in the street. And we can go into this in more detail if you'd like, but I'll sort of breeze through it quickly. It's primarily exclusive guideway, except for the narrower section of Florida north of the downtown grid. So we go up Florida on the left side, shift to the right side where it's the 3-lane section now, go north to Palm, across Palm, and then southbound on Tampa, go into an exclusive guideway all the way from Tampa Heights south into the core of downtown, and then connect back to the existing system. So primarily exclusive guideway. We went through an evaluation of the vehicles. We compared the existing replica vehicles to the benefits that we would get with a modern streetcar vehicle. The decision was made to advance the project assuming a modern streetcar vehicle. So that's higher capacity, ease of accessibility, longer service life of the vehicle, and with the potential to extend the service easily with that same vehicle technology. The stop configuration, as I mentioned, a right side stop. So if you think about this as looking north on Florida Avenue, these stops would occur on an island in the parking lane that would be next to the guideway. So we wouldn't be displacing space on the sidewalk, and we have fairly tight sidewalk conditions on much of Florida Avenue. And that would also allow for that right side stop condition that would occur with a local bus or a BRT bus or another transit vehicle. I mentioned the modernization improvements. That's the guideway reconstruction in key points along the route, the station improvements within the footprint of the existing station. In our early discussions about the impacts on the historic district in Ybor City, we've made a commitment to maintain the existing look and feel of those stops, to either remove and replace the existing shelters or do shelters that match the design of those shelters in Ybor City. Then we'll move into a design effort for the shelters for the new extension. The streetcar barn, we've tested different configurations of using that site and expanding that building and reworking the track in the yard that's on the east side of the existing building. This can fit. We can fit at least 10 vehicles and possibly 12 new vehicles on that property. So we'll be advancing the project without looking at having to buy a new site and build a new maintenance facility. We can reuse that facility. And then an expansion could be served by a storage facility off-site. So the maintenance could occur on the existing building. We could store additional vehicles on another location if we expand to the west or north in a future phase of the project. The cost, we've developed the cost consistent with FTA's guidance about capital cost estimating and operating cost estimating. It's a $237 million project as it's currently defined, and that's year of expenditure dollars. So those dollars are escalated in the cost estimate to when the money's spent. So some of those escalation occurs through design, some of that occurs in construction and vehicle procurement. So these are really 2024 dollars generally, but the way that the cost estimate works, they're escalated to the point where the money's spent across the project. The way it's defined currently, this is for the way the project definition for FTA's purposes. We took a share of the cost for the new vehicles and the maintenance facility proportionally and allocated that across from modernization to extension. So right now, each of those project sides of the project shares the cost of those common things that are shared by both sides of the project, modern vehicles and the maintenance facility. And then the operations would be around $8,000 a year, escalated beyond start year. So we're working again on refining the operation costs as part of the funding plan. So we'll have new numbers on that, and we'll have those escalated out and match that against local sources for to pay for those costs.
You say 8,000, did you mean 8 million?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, $8 million. I'm reading mine. I'm not following my own notes on the slide.
You should get
yes.
2 if it's 8,000.
Yes. The FTA has a very specific format for presenting the cost, so we're sharing that with you. I won't go through the details of this, but you can see how the costs have been allocated across the project. And then the funding plan, which you can see, we have a lot of to-be-determined items. We're in discussions now with the city and HART about who's going to support which portions of the cost of the project as we move forward. But what we're looking at is a total local funding of $68 million for the project, split between city surtax, city other, And if you think about city other, that would be the special service district, which exists now to support operations. Hart surtax and other, and potentially other local sources. So we're in the beginning stages of working out the details of how those numbers will be split up to support the project. We've sent a formal letter from the city and Hart to DOT requesting that they budget in future years of the FDOT work program for the state. Federal is called Small Starts, state is called New Starts. So the state New Starts program, we're asking that they start to set aside that money in the work program to support the federal share or the state share of the project, which would be 50% of the non-federal money. So the broader schedule, I had talked about what we're up to now in the short term, but in the spring, we'd wrap up this project development phase. Design and engineering would start at 30% design, so that's where we dive into the details about things like utility impacts, specific locations for the stops and impacts associated with those locations. Traffic operations and traffic signals, we start to look at what the implications are for that in more detail. And then the city is also, in their IOC plan, has requested support for funding for future extension study. So as this moves into design, the next phase of this project will be looked at, and that'll look at potential service west or north, depending on how that project plays out. In the summer of 2020, the Smart Starts ratings submittal, the ratings research will be complete. The submittal will go to FTA, and that will provide the project rating, which will be the basis for FTAs stacking us up against other projects around the country of a similar scale in the Small Starts program. And design and engineering will continue. 2022, 2023, that design and engineering will be complete. A full funding grant agreement with FTA will occur, so the actual FTA money will come to the project in the 2022-23 timeframe. Then 2 years for construction and vehicle procurement with start of service 2024, 2025.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate the presentation. Any questions? Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
Using your last slide regarding the funding, the ask for this schedule is projected to be $237 million. Is that?
Our request to FTA?
Yeah, well, yes.
FTA in the Small Starts program, it's limited to 100 million, so it would be 100 million from FTA, 50% of the remainder from DOT, New Starts, and then the other 50% is local.
Okay.
So that would be all for transportation surtax money.
So regarding the actual streetcar project, we're looking for $1 million from FTA in 2020.
100 million,
100
yeah.
million.
I mean, 100 million.
Yeah.
In 2020, 21, 22?
2021,
Okay, great, thank you.
we would start, that would initiate the process, and then the money we're projecting the money would flow back to the project in 2022, 2023.
Excellent, thank you.
Any other questions? Mm-hmm. Commissioner Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. I know right now that FDOT's subsidizing the operations at $1 million a year. What is the projected operations costs for the streetcar under this scenario?
Oh, we're projecting 8 million a year.
8
at
million a
start.
year to operate?
Yeah.
Okay. But we don't know yet who's going to be paying the 8 million?
No, I mean, the general assumption is we're starting to develop the financing plan as it would be supported by the Special Service District, which should be generating significantly more money. We're looking at projecting that number out, all for transportation money. And then we'll look at the implication of reintroducing fares or not, and that'll feed into this next phase of discussions we're having with the city and Hart about the operations policies and concepts.
And my second question is this, the CSX tracks, which I'm very much want and have been working on, looking at that as a commuter rail option. And I have been told repeatedly about the conflict between having two regular trains run in the downtown area, crossing tracks, and this would cross the CSX track. So what information can you give about that, or how is that being looked at? What implications does this have in terms of that?
we've had preliminary coordination with CSX about the crossing. We've talked about the official process is that it would, the next stage would be to enter into an agreement with CSX to develop a recommended crossing strategy, which would include design, but it will also include operation. So if that's gates or other features and who's got priority. So the assumption that we would be working under until we actually dive into that process would be that a commuter line and the existing freight would take precedence. The crossing vehicles would stop as they do now. So the streetcar would operate like a bus along the corridor. It would stop at the crossing and it would proceed. But there would be additional controls at the crossing because of the track-to-track crossing. So we would anticipate gates and signals, but I'm not sure what form that would take yet until we get into the design effort.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Wagner?
Does that $8 million a year include a
Wagner,
system preservation?
pull your microphone.
I'm sorry. Does that $8 million a year in operations include a sinking fund for system preservation?
It will need to. That's part of the requirement for FTA when we present the plan.
So it will need to, but does it now?
That $8 million is the first year cost. We haven't projected it out, so we have to look at the longer term maintenance of the existing system, which is some of those improvements are funded now through the city. So that would be part of the projection. We have to run a 20-year operating cost projection, and that's one of the issues that FTA would be looking at.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chair, please.
Councilman Citro?
Will Hart still be asking for the close to $500,000 a year from the CRAs in Tampa?
That's part of the current discussion that we're having with the city and with HART about supporting operations.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. And now we'll bring up Justin Willits to discuss the BRT arterial study.
While he's coming forth, I want to recognize the interim CEO of HART, Attorney Carol House Stewart's in the back. Just want to recognize you, classmate. Good morning.
Good morning, Board. Justin Willits, Senior Planner with HART. I'm just going to give you a relatively brief overview of the BRT study and then happy to take any questions about it. Really, the study is aiming to connect downtown to the University of South Florida
They know how to.
and the area around USF and Fowler. It's a little bit different than the presentation yesterday, so hopefully there's something new in here for the few of you that have seen this. But the purpose of this study, is to identify a corridor using some combination of Florida, Nebraska, and/or Fowler avenues to connect downtown Tampa to the University of South Florida and the USF Tampa campus. The primary goals are to improve safety and transit operating conditions, improve connectivity for east-west routes, and improve local transit access for communities between USF and downtown Tampa, including bicycle and pedestrian connectivity and signalized crossing improvements, where we recognize that the main safety problems we have along these corridors are getting to and from the bus stops and making that environment more safe for our existing customers and potential future customers are essential to the viability and success of this project. The identified transit needs include expanded transit options for new and existing riders, better connectivity between the two major regional centers, and providing a premium transit service to support the City of Tampa's plans for denser redevelopment and long-term economic growth. And we want to assume the trips that are created by this denser development can be made on transit, and we're not assuming a bunch more automobile trips along these corridors. This is where we are in the process. We completed our preliminary alternatives public workshop, and we're getting ready for the recommended alternative public workshop as we get ready to ramp up for phase 2 in the spring. The previous presentation touched on all the coordinating efforts, but as stated, there's a lot going on between downtown and USF, and I'm not going to read those off to you again, as we're all pretty familiar with them. The Heights Mobility Study was kind of the precursor to this study, and the concepts that were kind of vetted, partially vetted in that study are consistent with what we're proposing to date in this that show either a business access transit lane, also known as a BAT lane, or mixed traffic on the constrained sections of the corridor and the alignment that we are about to show you. It's consistent with a lane reduction south of Violet on the one-way pairs that are currently under capacity. Therefore, we have the ability to repurpose those lanes for the use of transit exclusively for most of the one-way pair sections. And with the non-motorized enhancements that I've previously mentioned and have been included in many studies to date. So the initial alternatives and screenings, we looked at 17 different options for crossing from Florida and Tampa one-way pairs over to Nebraska, and went through a two-stage screening process, and the highest scoring of those 17 were Palm Avenue, Waters, and Lineball. And at that point, we removed Palm because of the duplication with the Metro Rapid Service, and moved ahead with the Waters and Lineball alignment, and then Lineball was the one that surfaced. After reviewing this with our CEO and staff, we agreed that this made the most sense for potential future land use considerations, making the operations as clean and rapid as possible, and are also consistent with repurposing some lanes to get as much dedicated guideway along the alignment as possible. As I said, the Lineball crossover is shown here as the initial BRT alignment, which gives us approximately 66% dedicated guideway as our baseline conservative estimate. We think we can get that a little bit higher to satisfy the 75% criteria laid out in the All for Transportation surtax funding, but we are moving forward with this as our baseline before we get into the detailed engineering and concept refinement. And as I alluded to earlier, the benefits for this alignment are a higher opportunity for infill and redevelopment, higher existing transit use and more uses compatible with transit, higher degree of supporting land use, and a greater potential for travel time savings and competing with single passenger automobile travel. One of the things we discussed with the project team and consultants was that we really wanted to aspire to have this be a Florida directly to Fowler service, but in the short term, that alignment isn't as viable. One, because of the land use north of Lineball on Florida Avenue is primarily high-end auto retailers or auto retailers in general that are not currently driving a lot of ridership. And this would also require significant reconstruction of the Fowler 275 interchange. And we didn't want to have to tackle a major regional interchange as part of our transit project. So the Lineball, again, was the logical choice and why we deferred to the scoring that our consultant team came up with to stick with that alignment, although this is kind of the long-term plan. We have a stakeholder committee and a technical committee. We're currently going to reach out to a few additional stakeholders per the comments of our board yesterday. They're really an advisory committee, though. As a reminder, they don't actually vote on anything, so I'm not sure if that changes the sentiment of the board, but we are going to add some more stakeholders and try to bring in some more community members to help us vet this project as we move through the planning phases. Right now, we only have two community stakeholders, one from Forest Hills, one from the Seminole Heights area. We're going to reach back out to the Tampa Heights applicant that we had, and then a few additional folks as well, potentially the CAC and a few other neighborhoods. And we can update you on at the next time I'm here. I'll let you know how that goes. A little review of our December 9th workshop at the Seminole Heights Garden Center. We reviewed the recommended BRT alignment. Two of our commissioners were there. Thanks again for coming. We reviewed preferred elements of BRT, which are level boarding stations, off-board fare payment, which reduce the time we spend at each stop and help speed the service up and increase that average operating speed. And we also identified additional transit needs for those intersecting routes and some pedestrian and bicycle and now scooter connectivity issues to help get people more safely to our stations. And that gets us to next steps. We're going to launch our public outreach online survey now, continue to identify those supporting transit and non-motorized projects, develop a prioritization approach for those supporting projects, develop the recommended alternative and an implementation plan, and hold our next workshop next month, and then take the staff's recommendation to the board in March or April of this year before we go into phase 2 and choose a path that goes into the federal process or an alternative where we could do a couple of several minor improvements to improve operations along the corridor as it exists today. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Any questions? Councilman Rivera, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just very briefly, you were looking, if you're looking for other community input, folks you'd mentioned Forest Hills, I represent a lot of that area, so I'll have my office, if I may, reach out to you for more involvement from the USF, Forest Hills, Copeland Park, other areas in the North Tampa area. You know, for me, this is a really exciting project, not just for what it is as an isolated point, what it can mean for our community, but when you put it in conjunction and in cooperation with what could be happening in the next year with the discussion on a TIF or taxing district for the USF Bush Boulevard area. You put that together, and I think it's going to be a real explosion, if you will, in a good sense, of innovation and economic development and really exciting things happening in an area that has been very, very ignored for a long time. So, you know, the special benefit we're going to be getting from the taxing district, I think, cannot be separated from the idea of making USF a walkable community, the Fowler area, a walkable community that is friendlier to transit options, and this is obviously a giant leap in that regard. So I'll be emailing my assistant to reach out to you, and we'll set that up.
Okay,
thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Mr.
Chair.
Overman, you're recognized.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. And this relates back to the previous presentation. We got a funding cycle illustration. So we know when the streetcar project is going to apply for small starts for the expansion of their project. Based on your timeline, when do you anticipate applying for a small starts grant to complete the project or to move it along to the next phase?
I believe tentatively we would be going the year after the streetcar project.
What year is that?
2022, I believe. Is the streetcar 2021?
Streetcar is this year. The streetcar would be applying this summer, August or September of
Potentially
2020.
2021
So
or
you're right.
22.
So the year after would be August or September of 2021.
Right, correct.
Okay, all right, great. And we're going to see a presentation from TBARTA soon. I was curious, we heard a lot from the streetcar on the coordination between what Arterial is going to do as well as what we're going to see from TBARTA. And you wiped out Palm, and although that is where the streetcar is going to turn around, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So the goal with this Arterial is just to pass that and allow connecting to it without necessarily interfering with the right-of-way?
The Palm reference was as a potential crossover. So we'll still be serving that area with the BRT. It's just we wouldn't be crossing over there. We'd continue north to Linebaugh on Florida Tampa.
Okay, and then in an example of what I had seen in TBARTA's, which we'll see in a few moments, they had which hasn't yet apparently been determined, they had a regional transit stop sort of identified in the Waters area where there is an interstate exit, and yet there's not one at Linebaugh, and we're avoiding Fowler. So I'm trying to figure out when Waters is so wide, why we're avoiding that area. Or why it didn't rank as high as it did in your surveys, I guess is a better question.
Well, we still feel like we're going to serve the area well from the corridor that we're on. But the reason that Linebaugh is attractive is also because we're avoiding any interchange congestion because it doesn't have ramps to the interstate there. So there's a lot less traffic to deal with passing under.
I mean,
I'm not sure if I got your question.
I'm sorry, but the whole goal of transit is to allow people to connect. And yet we're avoiding points of connection. So I'm trying to get a better understanding of, yeah, it's great to avoid the congestion, but if you're not making connections for people to be able to connect to other parts of the system, that
Well, we're connecting to all of our existing service and potentially the future TBARTA service. We're just not connecting to the interstate because we're not operating on it, and we're still going to be able to transfer to the regional system if they select a station area at Waters. It's just that we're not connecting to the 275 facility. and we're avoiding the congestion of it by not using an existing interchange as a crossover.
Okay, thank you.
Gerardo, you ready for that?
Yes, good morning. Thank you for your presentation. And just a continuation of Councilman Vieira, I would love to see citizen input included from that Temple Terrace area. We've had, especially in our business community, quite a bit of interest in the viability of transport into downtown. So if you'd like me to get Councilman Schisler to connect with you, or if you could reach out to Councilman Schisler from your board, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you.
Commissioner Kemp, be recognized.
I got most of the questions answered yesterday at the presentation, which Councilman Schisler was there and already had spoken up with that. But Fowler Avenue, I'm just wondering, that is an arterial in need of help. And what is the schedule for that in terms of FDOT, I know it's been looked at?
The Fowler study, I'd have to lean on somebody from FDOT to comment on the timeline of their study. But I believe they've kind of paused to let the BRT study kind of get a little further along. Is that correct?
So there's nothing imminent?
Nothing imminent, no. But the concepts we've developed so far work within the existing right-of-way and kind of reallocate some of the existing roadway space without assuming any lane reductions on Fowler.
Okay, thanks.
Sherberg, you recognized.
Thanks. Following up on Commissioner Overman's question, so I'm not sure, maybe I'm missing something, but I love seeing all these projects coming together, and I'm wondering if I'm not understanding exactly how this, as well as the streetcar, actually connect to the regional rapid transit. Is there a place where they all come together so that they're all connected?
The downtown intermodal center would likely be that spot, although that's still being studied.
For all three of them?
Yes.
And then what about, though, up by USF? So if you were up on Fowler, or you wanted to stop, you would have to come all the way down 275 to downtown and then go back up?
Well, as their station area concepts currently exist, the Waters station would be one. I'm not sure if the regional service is definitely stopping at Fowler. They've talked about Fowler and potentially Bears. Fowler and Bears. So yes, the other intermodal facility that's been identified at this point is the southeast corner of Nebraska and Fowler, which would likely be the connection point at the northern end. So you'd have one downtown, Waters, and Fowler along the BRT.
Right.
And along both BRTs, regional and our local. And then the downtown would most likely be serving Streetcar and both BRTs and other services as well. Does that make sense?
Maybe. I get the downtown part. I'm just missing how, on the northern end of the arterial BRT, how do you access the regional rapid transit? That's the question that I'm not understanding. And I think you said, and maybe it's that this is a short-term, the line ball is a short-term idea, and then maybe in the future you would connect to that. And I don't know from a resource perspective if that makes sense, but I just...
That's really a question of the design of their station area, if it's in the median or on the shoulders, and how they connect to if they come off the interstate to serve that stop. But the connection would be made to the intersection of Nebraska and Fowler, where we would be serving because we cross over at Linebaugh to get to that station. Long term, if we were to switch to Fowler, we would still be serving that station after we come across. So it jives with both our short-term and our long-term strategy.
Anything else?
No, I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Moreno, you recognize.
I'm
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Thank you.
I'm right there with you.
Justin, I think the question that I had, you're looking at trying to make sure this runs in its own right of way 50% of the time. So how do you balance that with the potential capture of new ridership? And I'm specifically relating the fact that you've made that connection at Linebaugh versus, say, Waters or Bird, where you have the large Kmart property, the large Greyhound property, the track property. Going back to the comparison between this and the TBARTA study, it does seem as if there's going to be future high-density residential in that property, whereas at Linebaugh, you may have the dedicated right-of-way, you don't have the congestion of the interstate, but you may not have ridership. So how do you, in your looking at this, how do you balance that, the reliability of the transit service versus the potential for future ridership that currently does not exist today?
So it's the parcels north of Waters on Florida Avenue are also very attractive for redevelopment, and they're also driving existing ridership. So when we submit to FTA, we have to look at the existing conditions, and that's what they look at. We, from a planning perspective, are also looking at what we think will be there in the future, although we do not get points for that from the FTA. So if you think about the Sulphur Springs area and how we think it's going to redevelop, and if we have this regional service, the people accessing that area or leaving from that area via transit will be able to do so on Nebraska, on the regional service, or on the local service on Florida. So we didn't think it was crucial for us to cross over there. We think the walking trip from Florida Avenue or Nebraska to a regional service is going to be less than a quarter mile in a super, we hope, walkable environment. So it's not going to be the parking lot desert it is now. It's going to be a more comfortable, hopefully a much more enjoyable experience than is out there today. So I think that's how we're kind of envisioning all of these coming together.
Thank you.
Councilman Citro, you recognize.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I'll reserve my question for later.
Okay. Commissioner Kemp.
For the record, I think that is the right plan that you have right now. I don't think people understand that one of the number one transit routes that we already have is Florida Avenue, and it goes pretty much on this trajectory. Another of the most robust transit routes we have that I intend to make sure stays there is Nebraska Avenue. This is a perfect regional connection. You should not have regional stops all over the place. And it's going to connect at the corner of Fowler and Nebraska, I imagine. And it's an excellent plan. This is what it should be. All of these things should stay in place. This is what we already have. It's already getting new and increased ridership. And when there's frequency and when we don't, if we can get some signal prioritization at Hillsborough is the problem. I mean, the other places are under capacity at Tampa and Florida, but I think it's a really good plan, and I think it's a way to move forward, and it will do everything we want it to do.
All right, I think we should leave it there.
You're absolutely right. That's where we're going to leave it, right there.
Thank you all very much.
And for our final presentation, we have Brian Pissarro from TBARTA to present the rapid transit.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Brian Pissarro. I'm a principal planner with TBARTA. I'm also the staff project manager of the study for the Regional Rapid Transit. Also with me today is Scott Pringle from WSP. He's our consultant project manager on the study. We'll both be happy to answer any questions you have at the end of the presentation. Before I get into the slides, just a little bit of background. The Regional Rapid Transit, or the RRT as we call it, was identified in the Regional Transit Feasibility Study. This was a plan that TBARTA adopted back in 2018. In that study, we looked at various regional connections within the 5-county TBARTA service area. The purpose of the plan was to identify projects that would be the most competitive for state and federal dollars, and the RRT is what came out on top. So that's how we got here. The purpose of the RRT is to provide all-day modern mobility that provides quick, safe, reliable, frequent, and regional rapid service. This purpose statement was crafted by our Citizens Advisory Committee. When I say frequent, what I mean by that is what we are shooting for is 10-minute frequency all day. That is what we're going to try to provide. The project, the study, we began it in spring of 2019. It's a 2-year study. We hope to have it wrapped up by summer of 2021. The study has 5 major milestones. We reached the first milestone in November. Milestone 1 involved determining the number of station areas. We're at 13. and coming up with 5 alternatives that we're going to carry into 10% design. We are now working towards milestone 2, which we will hit in May. So between now and then, WSP is going to be working on the 10% design of those 5 alternatives. We're going to be hosting a series of charrettes because we want to get input from the community on what they would like the stations to look like. When we get to milestone 2, 2 important things are going to happen. The first is that we will narrow down those 5 alternatives to 1 recommended alternative plus maybe 2 others that we're going to keep in our back pocket just in case any problems, environmental issues pop up later on with the recommended alternatives. That's the first thing. And the second thing that's going to happen in the spring is that is when we're going to request entry into project development under FTA's CIG program. Once FTA gives us permission to enter into project development phase, we will begin work on the environmental analysis that's required under NEPA. At milestone 3, which we'll hit sometime in fall, winter of 2020, we'll have much but not all of the environmental analysis done so that we can now label the recommended alternative the locally preferred alternative. It's pretty much the same thing. Locally preferred alternative is FTA's terminology. Then in the spring of 2021, we'll hit milestone 4, which will be the completion of the 30% design on the locally preferred alternative. And that will also be the time that we request a NEPA decision from FTA on the environmental analysis. Then in summer of 2021, that's when we hit milestone 5. That is when we send off our application to FTA and ask for a project rating. Now, there is some variation on what happens after that depending on whether we apply as a new starts or a small starts project. With new starts, FTA will have to rate the project again once the design is fully complete. With small starts, you don't go through that extra process. But either way, regardless of whether it's small starts or new starts, FTA is not going to give you any money until you've completed the design and you've identified all of your local match. So that being said, let's get more into the detail about the route. So I mentioned there are 13 station areas. These are the ones that you see on the screen here. Each of these circles represents a 1-mile area, so a half-mile radius. The circles in blue are the intermodal centers that are being studied by FDOT. The 8 circles in yellow are the other station areas. So going from north to south up in Pasco County, we have planned station areas at State Road 54 and State Road 56. In Hillsborough County, Bears Avenue, USF area, Waters Avenue / Bird Street. In the Tampa-Seminole Heights area, that circle's a little bigger because we're still trying to figure out where exactly that station area is going to be. The Intermodal Center in downtown Tampa, Himes Avenue, West Shore, then going across the bay to Pinellas, a station at Gateway Carillon, 62nd Avenue, Tropicana Field, and 4th Street. This map shows how the regional rapid transit, the HART Arterial BRT, and the Streetcar extension overlay with one another. One of the nice things that we saw when we ran the ridership forecast model was that all 3 of these projects did better together, and that the RRT was not pulling riders off of the local service. So that was nice to see. Before I get into the 5 alternatives, there's a few terms that I need to define. Bus on shoulder. What we mean by this is the provision for transit use by constructing a full depth shoulder that's available for the buses only when the speeds in the general purpose lanes drop below 35 miles per hour. So basically this is a bypass. This would be a bypass lane for the buses. Business access and transit lane, or a BAT lane. This is a bus lane, but vehicles are allowed to enter into that lane to make turnoffs at either at intersections or into business driveways. And then freeway dedicated BRT. This is a dedicated lane for BRT that occurs within the interstate footprint, and it provides BRT service all day with no speed limitations. Only the 2nd and 3rd are regarded by FTA as a dedicated bus lane. The first one, the bus on shoulder, is not. That's important to know because when we go to apply under the Capital Grants program, for new starts, 50% of the route has to be in what's called a dedicated bus lane. So the 5 alternatives, there's actually 6. We're doing a no-build alternative, but we're not counting that as one of the 5. Under the no-build alternative, the bus would operate in mixed traffic where you see the light blue. It would have access to bustle and shoulders in the segments that you see in orange. It would operate in tolled express lanes across the Howard Franklin Bridge, and it would operate in those business access transit lanes in downtown St. Pete. There would be little to no investment in the stations under this scenario. This baseline alternative would not be eligible under FTA's capital investment grant program. However, we're required to do a no-build alternative. In alternative one, the running way is exactly the same as in the no-build. The difference between this and the no-build is that under alternative one, you do have investment in the stations. Alternative one would not be eligible for new starts. It could be eligible for small starts if the total project cost is less than $300 million and we were seeking less than $100 million in CIG funds. Alternative two, this is actually the recommendation that came out of the Regional Transit Feasibility Plan. With alternative two, we are at about 60% dedicated bus lanes. The segments that you see in purple are the freeway BRT lanes. Alternative three is the same as alternative two. The only difference is this includes freeway BRT lane in that segment of 275 north of Bears. Alternative four is the same as alternative two. The difference with that is across the Howard Franklin Bridge, instead of the bus being in the tolled express lanes, it would be operating in a dedicated bus lane. And then alternative five is 100% dedicated. And that concludes my presentation. So as I said, Scott or I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Any questions? Commissioner Overman, you recognize.
The alternative two, could you go back to
Sure.
that slide for me, please? There, you had mentioned of a stop in the Seminole Heights area. And there was dedicated, bus on shoulders. If the lanes in any of the alternatives, or the alternatives anywhere past alternative two, do they require an expansion of the north side of 275?
We are working within the existing interstate footprint, and we do not expect any additional right-of-way needs for this project.
For alternative two or all of them?
For any of the alternatives.
Really? Okay.
And our goal is to really maximize the right-of-way that's already out there today, and specifically looking at redesigning some of the shoulder space to accommodate that dedicated lane.
The reason I'm asking that is because in all the alternatives beyond this, it does require station investment. And if that is coordinating with what's happening with the ulterior plans, you may not necessarily need a station in the Seminole Heights area where there is absolutely no room for it. I mean, you might be able to tear down the Burger King and the pharmacy at MLK, but that intersection is such a mess right now that adding regional bus transit in and out of there is going to completely remove your 10-minute frequency goal from reality, especially if you've got to get back on the interstate at that spot. So, that was why I was asking the questions earlier about the Bird, Fowler, transit transfer at Fowler, if that land that's there that I think FDOT owns at Nebraska and Fowler is a transit asset possibility, development asset possibility, that wouldn't interfere with other business in areas south of that, or Bird or Waters becomes that option. Being able to connect there is not unreasonable for those that might want to get on a regional system, or they can use Arterial and get on downtown to connect with the regional system. But I do recognize the value of that investment for redevelopment as long as affordable housing is attached to it and required. Just saying that from that perspective. In terms of the station investments, if that's part of the overall goal, it helps with the FTA application. And that's where I was trying to see that. The other question I have is in the FTA small starts or new starts application coming in 2021, I'm assuming, then how will that application involve the identification of local match. What localities or agencies are you planning to include in that application at this time?
Well, for the full route, it's a 3-county route. We have to find local contribution from all 3 counties.
And the counties or the agencies, the bus agencies in there? I mean, is TBARTA going to operate a regional bus system? Or are they looking to partner with the
The
local?
guidance that we've gotten from our board, because the other project that we got going on right now is the development of our first regional transit development plan. And that question was brought up in our workshop, is TBARTA going to be a direct operator of transit service? And the guidance that we have gotten from our board is for TBARTA to contract out transit service, either to one of the county transit operators or to a private transit operator. But that TBARTA would not be a direct operator of transit service.
Okay, so I'm trying to ask a very straight question. I need a straight answer. If you are contracting out to the local bus agencies, I'm trying to figure out if there is an opportunity, if we want to call it that, for HART to have to shave off part of its budget to support TBARTA's regional transit program. Is that what we're talking about? Or is it going to get reimbursed for supporting it?
I think ideally we are looking to, we don't have, the reason why you're not getting a direct answer to your question is because we're still investigating that. As you heard from the presentation regarding the streetcar, we also do have to do our financial plan. We have yet to begun that exercise. So
Okay,
we'll know
that's,
more when we get there.
that helps.
Ideally, we're going to be looking for partnerships across the board, from the counties, from the cities, from the transit agencies, the individual neighborhoods, anybody who would potentially benefit from the project, realizing that this is a regional asset.
Right, and so in that in mind, we heard earlier that the streetcar anticipates about an $8 million operating cost, right? Is that what's the number? So you're not at that stage yet, but we're moving this project forward with the idea that we'll have that number somewhere down the road?
Correct.
Yes.
That's correct. We are developing, like I said, we are developing that financial plan. We have some early estimates from the planning, but now that we're getting into actual design, that will definitely give us a lot more detail and further educate us as to actually what the definition of this project is so that we can have those numbers for you.
In fact, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe when we get to spring of this year, when we request entry into project development phase, we have to provide a preliminary operations plan to FTA and some costs so that they know, because they need to know, is this going to be a new starts or a small starts project, because there are thresholds.
That's why I'm asking the question. Because as we know, and I made a handout for everybody, I'm looking at where this region is going to be talking to FTA on our projects and our schedule. And you want to pass one of those around? We've got a robust federal transit application process going. We've got the streetcar application in 2020. We've got HART's Arterial BRT in 2021. TBARTA, I am assuming, is going to start moving forward in 2021 with its new starts or small starts, whatever that looks like. That obviously needs to be, in partnership with what's happening with TB Next, if we're looking at any kind of right-of-way expansion anywhere along the way, but also redesign for protected guideway for you to qualify for the funding that you're looking to accomplish, right?
Right.
And so, and then we also have, sort of down the road on our priority list with TMA, we are, looking at further streetcar extensions. We're looking at water, transit, or ferry, especially when we look to try and support our largest employer in Hillsborough County, which is MacDill Air Force Base. And then we're talking about trying to figure out how to activate a transit asset that is currently dedicated to freight, but could be utilized for commuter in the area, in the negotiations that HART is moving forward and is now on the TMA list for negotiating with CSX. So I'm trying to build a budget. I'm trying to look at, well, I got $8 million here for operating, but $1 $100 million max. Are we going to be all competing for the same dollars? Or when we see multiple applications come in between 20 and 21 and 22, are we going to be fighting over the same dollars from the FTA? Can somebody answer that question for me?
If I may, Commissioner, I think that's a very important question, and I appreciate the fact that you asked it. I also want to thank the MPO staff. I think the way they've actually sequenced the presentations this morning is a very logical approach to how you would sequence these 3 projects and moving forward. Looking at the streetcar being first out of the gate, the arterial BRT soon thereafter, and with the regional BRT coming even after that, given its partnership with FDOT. And you're right, the question about, making sure that you're building a proper budget, FTA is going to be asking those same questions. And it's not conducive for Tampa Bay to have multiple project applications in the same congressional fiscal cycle.
Right.
So if we can sequence those projects year after year, it puts us in a great position because it also helps reassure the federal government that we are investing in a network that supports itself amongst all these different projects, and it's well coordinated and consistent and seamless connections. So, I think I personally am very excited about the opportunity to start actually building a truly premium transit network in Tampa Bay.
Okay, that helps me understand. I'm just wanting to make sure we're not fighting over the same dollars. So.
Sherberg, you recognize.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on my question from the previous presentation. After seeing this one, and Jason, this one will let you know. And so I understand how these connect together. So if you're going to have the Hart Arterial BRT at Nebraska and Fowler, which is not far from 275, I don't know, is your station up there at Fowler on Nebraska, or is it, or you don't know
We have
yet?
not selected exact. We have not selected exact parcels yet. We are moving into that part of the study right now, though, where we are going to be
Okay.
zeroing in on parcels.
And are there opportunities to join forces on that and so that there's some cost savings, so that the Hart and the Regional Rapid Transit Station are together and some cost savings there?
Ideally, absolutely. We definitely want to have all the, like I mentioned before, even the federal government's going to be looking for us to do that, to make sure that all these projects are talking to each other, that we're consistent, we're providing that seamless connection. And there's a really great opportunity here where we're going to get 3 touch points between this regional service and the much-needed arterial BRT service at Fowler Avenue, at Watersburg, and then downtown Tampa. Downtown Tampa, we get that additional touch point with the streetcar. So again, it's about building this network that really carry us forward.
Mr. Kemp, you recognize.
Thank you. Just to be clear, Commissioner Overman, so that you understand, because I've been going through this for a couple years, there's utterly no money to support this regional system, 0. And the money will not come from the state. I've been very clear, had clear answers about that. So you would just expect, and it is expected, I can tell you, that our sales tax would be dedicated to this at the expense, I believe, of our own transit systems, and I don't believe that's the way it should be funded at all, but I think going forward, there are no other alternatives. Second, in terms of clarifying the right-of-way, yes, FDOT will not have to get more right-of-way because they own so much from downtown to Fowler Avenue, but it does include an expansion of 30 feet of roadway in addition to what is there to accommodate anything but the no build and the first option. So that should be clear about that. That would be a great expense. It would expand the roadway tremendously. And there's no interstate roadway in the nation used for exclusive bus use, but for the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, which has for decades run a bus every 3 minutes. So I'd like to add that to it. And finally, you're absolutely correct. I brought it up several times about, well, they were calling it the Tampa Heights stop, and now it's suddenly turned into the Seminole Heights stop. It would make no sense to do that, particularly if you had something at Waters. It's it doesn't make any sense in terms of the regional transit because you don't want to be pulling off on a regional system every other place and stopping. It really defeats the purpose. You need to have long distance stops if that's what your intent is, not stops all over the place for that. It doesn't make sense for Seminole Heights as well. People can just go downtown or to Fowler or wherever it is to make that regional connection. And finally, I'd like to know, in October, FDOT informed us about bringing forward the next TBX preferred alternative, and I'm just wondering, because that concerns that portion there, when will the public hearing for the next preferred alternative I know you're not the person to answer that, but do we know that yet, Ed? I'm sorry?
End of February.
End of February. Okay, great. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Executive Director's report.
Thank you so much. Last month, we checked in on a couple of adjustments that might still need to be made to our board calendar. There were some questions about our November meeting, so we did go back and double-check with the county commission, the land use meetings in particular. We did leave the November 4th board date where it is, which is Wednesday, the day after Election Day. But in further coordination with the school board, they provided their final calendar after we reviewed our calendar here, and they had a couple of conflicts. So I just wanted to advise you of that. We did make a couple more adjustments to board meeting dates, shifted some of the meetings to the second week of the month on the Wednesday. So that is reflected on your calendar invitations, on the calendar on our website, on the printed calendar that you have in front of you, on the printed calendar sitting out there for everyone to pick up. So hopefully there will not be any confusion about our dates for this year, but I just wanted to make you aware that there were a couple of additional changes after our meeting last month. You do have in front of you our printed 2020 calendar for the year. We are celebrating a really active year in 2019. So a lot of great things highlighted by you. You didn't get one?
No.
That must be for you then.
Mine
And
already,
there's
mine already
stacks
went
more
to the
over
office, so I've.
But some great things highlighted by all of the agencies and local governments that you represent going on this past year, and a lot of progress. So looking forward to another great year with you this year. We do have on the calendar in March a board workshop on our priorities for the Transportation Improvement Program. We talked about that a little bit last month, about asking all of our local agencies to come and just have a conversation with the board members about the projects they'd like to advance for funding. So that is what is scheduled on March the 24th. We also talked last month about scheduling a workshop on managed lanes, on tolling policy, because we do have a lot going on. I'd like to schedule that in probably the June timeframe. I've talked with DOT staff. This is not an urgent matter from a timing point of view, so I think that would give us enough time to be able to have feedback into the decision-making process. That
Yep.
concludes
Any
my...
questions? Okay. Is there any old business? Any new business?
Allow Mr. Vella to comment. Mr. Vella asked to make a comment if he's still here. Chris Vella.
Who wants to make a comment?
Chris Vella.
Is he here?
I don't see him.
He left, okay.
We adjourn.
Thank